To the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'm Olga Oliker. I direct the Russia and Eurasia program here. I also will be the person to turn to in case of emergency, though there are, of course, exit signs in front of you and behind you. If we have to evacuate the building, please exit and go left and left again to assemble in front of the National Geographic building. I am thrilled to be hosting this conversation about Russia's foreign policy in the next Putin administration, which looks remarkably like the last Putin administration, but we'll see how it evolves and what that does for policy. I'm particularly thrilled to have this group of folks here who represent a variety of, let's say, opposition viewpoints from the Russian Federation. Most of them, all of them need no introduction, but it's my job to introduce them anyway. So. At the end to my left is Andrei Kozyrov, former foreign minister of the Russian Federation. Next to him, Vladimir Karamurza, who is the vice chairman of Open Russia and formerly the deputy leader of the People's Freedom Party and candidate for the Russian State Duma. Next to me on my right is Vitaly Shklarov, who's a political strategist and most recently was senior campaign advisor to Ksenia Sobchak in the Russian presidential election. And next to Vitaly is Natalia Arno, the founder and president of the Free Russia Foundation, which is a nonprofit NGO that informs US policymakers on developments in Russia. So I'm going to start with a pretty simple question, which I'm going to address to all of the panelists, and we can just go down the line answering it. On what do you think is at the core? You know, it's a very simple question. You should be able to cover it in 2 or 3 minutes. What do you think is at the core of Vladimir Putin's foreign policy? What is he trying to accomplish in his interactions with the rest of the world? Natalia, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Olga, and also thanks to Olga Khostunova of the IMR who invited me to speak here. It's my huge honor to be at CSIS and especially to speak at the same panel with such distinguished panelists and with the legendary Minister of Foreign Affairs, Andrei Kozyrov, with the best speaker of all times and of all people, Vladimir Karamurza, and probably one of the most interviewed campaign specialists in Russia, Vitaly Shklarov. So with Olga Oliker moderating this event, I feel myself as the fifth Beatle. But I'd like to start focusing on the phenomenon of disruption as the main Putin's choice for his foreign policy. Let me talk about the role of Russia in the world in the, with the increasing attempts to rethink the Kremlin's actions in Crimea, in Ukraine and in Syria, with the situation with human rights in Russia, and to move on to some constructive engagement with Putin's regime. While we have the US-Russian relations at the low of all the times, there are many voices in the West that are calling to turn the page with Putin's regime, to forget some past tensions, to start some dialogue with him in order to tackle together some important global crises like in Syria, North Korea, Iran, or some challenges like non-proliferation, terrorism, and so on. No doubt Russia is a strategic, important player. And of course, the US cannot just ignore engaging Russia on those very important issues. But at the same time, we all know how Putin acts and why he started to act like he does. When the West didn't do anything about the war with Georgia in 2008, a more devastating and bloody invasion followed in Ukraine followed in 2014. And of course, with trying to just deter this international reaction on the war in Ukraine, Putin raised his stakes and started this surprise operation in Syria. And what's next? We already have Russian mercenaries in Africa. Russia's willingness to intervene in the Libyan conflict, some smuggling of vital supplies to North Korea, circumventing international sanctions. So what can be next? The Baltic countries, Bulgaria, the West Balkans, we have already observed the attempt to overthrow a legitimate government in Montenegro. Well, let's, of course, not forget about this interference into Western elections. Of course, we can argue forever here if this interference had or hadn't any impact on the election results. But the main question here is, do we really want Russian hackers and trolls to be back and try it again so we all have more empirical data to analyze? So of course, with all these well-developed capabilities, hybrid capabilities, combination of information and cyber warfare, intrusions into domestic policies, acts of sabotage, of course Putin won't stop. And while trying to understand his policy, his main idea, we should always remember that now it's very beneficial for him to act in a disruptive way on the international arena.
Okay, thank you, Natalia. So Natalia has painted a picture of a Russian foreign policy that's inherently aggressive and aimed at disruption. Vitaly, do you agree with that? And what do you think, whether you agree with it or not, what do you think are some of what's the logic behind what the Russians are doing?
Well, there are actually a couple of layers, or a couple of vectors of the logic behind his rationale or his strategy. First of all, Putin has been ruling the country for 18 years, and I mean, the strategy has been changing a lot, on the one hand. On the other hand, I believe his logic comes from his sense of a betrayal of West. That's how he explains it to himself or to the people in Russia, and betrayal from the West, from America, partly because of particular political strategy of George W. Bush or Clinton administration towards Russia, partly because of extension of NATO towards border of Russia. And I believe everybody who has been involved in Russian politics or like dealing with Russia for like last decade could sense this feeling of open-minded Russia, beginning of 2000, 2005, and so on, and how rapidly this mood has changed when the Putin has this, or became this feeling of pressure from international from the West, partly, but also because of economy and stagnation in the country itself. So I believe the other layer of his rationale is not just this the sense of betrayal that leads or makes people like turn into the inward, draw inward, and basically rally people behind himself and helps elites unite behind Putin. Also, last development of sanctions, or many rounds of sanctions, of course, give him, in his way, sort of an explanation for this us against them strategy that always leads to isolation. And I believe Russia came to this point in the history and then in the political development to this state of isolation as a country that tries to survive on the one hand, and as a consequence from this, partly to the Russian propaganda that leads to Russian propaganda that uses the rhetoric of this sort of like West enemy thinking, or the confrontation with the West, with partly with USA, to sell domestically, or like to make up, to cover the stagnation and incapability of the government, or stagnation of the state. So of course, through the last years, especially after Ukraine, the propaganda machine that has been perfected and what became now like a perfect, I call it like a perfect oiled machine and perfect monster that works just with one particular goal, like to keep power, like to let people away from entering independent and oppositional politics, and to basically to sell domestically their own people this lies or this story of us against them that is actually not our Russians' fault but the fault of the West, and we trying actually just protect our country. And I believe because of this fairly good working strategy that the West is united against us, and that's why we have sanctions. That's why we have all diplomats like getting kicked out of several countries. I believe that helps President Putin, of course, to believe himself, but also to sell to the people that that's the only strategy. And if nobody wants us, then you have to unite behind my back, or behind the only leader who loves you and who protects you. And that's become, I believe, over the course of years, kind of his paradigm and his mantra that he is trying to maintain. And partly, of course, to be fair, is also, I believe, is West's, or it's a fault of the West to push Russia over the course of years to this isolation, or let Russia get to this isolation, and partly by breaking the promises in the 90s and the 2000s. I believe this was the vital time, or the crucial time, where Russia has changed the strategy.
Okay, thank you. So we have an aggressive Russia, which is selling that aggression at home in part through a narrative of being attacked and isolated by the West. Vladimir, do you agree with this assessment? Is there anything you want to add?
I think, first of all, thank you so much for hosting us here this afternoon, and thank you to CSIS and the Institute of Modern Russia for co-organizing our discussion. And when we talk about Putin's foreign policy, I think it's very important to keep in mind that his foreign policy is a reflection and a function and a continuation of his domestic policy. And that is the way it has always been in Russia, at least going back a century. One of the advantages of being a historian is that we look at kind of larger and bigger trends going back over the years. And if we look at the last century of Russian history, we will see unmistakably that domestic repression and external aggression have always been two sides of the same coin. They've always gone hand in hand. And if you think about this, a very strong inherent logic of that. Why would you expect a government that tramples on the rights of its own people and violates its own laws to be respectful of international norms or of the interests of other countries? It's not going to. And additionally, we know very well that authoritarian regimes that lack genuine democratic legitimacy at home very often use external aggression, aggressive foreign policy, the image posturing for their own domestic purposes. And this is, of course, something that we see Mr. Putin doing over the years. And if we look back at these now almost 18 years, scary to even say that, no, more than 18 years, this December will be 19 years since Mr. Putin came to power. People sometimes talk about the early Putin, the middle Putin, the late Putin. There was no early, mid, and late Putin. The trend has been exactly the same from the beginning. I remember the day, actually, I know this sounds really weird, but I remember the day when I personally realized who Vladimir Putin was and what he was about. This was December the 20th, 1999. He was still prime minister. He wasn't even president yet, not even acting president. It was still the last 2 weeks of Boris Yeltsin's presidency. And then on that day, Mr. Putin went to Lubyanka Square in Moscow to officially unveil a memorial plaque to Yuri Andropov, the chairman of the Soviet KGB, who had overseen the 1956 invasion of Hungary, a Soviet ambassador who, as chairman of the KGB, set up the infamous 5th Chief Directorate to target and persecute political dissidents, who had instituted and expanded the practice of punitive psychiatry, where those people who were against the communist regime were declared to be insane and sent to mental hospitals. So this is the guy who in many ways symbolized the worst of the Soviet political repression in the 20th century. And Vladimir Putin went to unveil a memorial plaque to him. Frankly, I don't think anybody should have been asking any more questions after that. Russia's a country of symbols. And when you start your rule by doing this, you make it absolutely clear what and how you're going to do. And then we saw this trend continue. Of course, it took him time to reach the extremes that we're seeing today, but the trend was always there. And when that famous question was asked in January of 2000, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, who is Mr. Putin? And there was a silence in the room, and then everybody started laughing. Well, for those who were willing to listen, the answer was already there. And in the first year of his rule, he reinstated the Soviet national anthem, the Stalin-era Soviet national anthem, another very strong, very potent symbol in a country where symbols are important. And very soon he moved from symbols to actions. And in his first 3 years, he had basically dismantled all the democratic institutions in Russia domestically, independent media, parliament as an independent institution, elections as a genuine institution. The first political prisoners appeared in Russia in 2003. And all the while he was doing that, many leaders in the West continued with a very naive or short-sighted assumption that, whatever Putin does domestically, let him have political prisoners, let him rig elections, let him muzzle the media and shut down independent TV channels. We can try to find some sort of a modus operandi with him on the international arena. And I'll never forget, for example, on June 25th, 2003, literally 3 days after Vladimir Putin pulled the plug on the last independent television network in Russia, not a figure of speech, 3 days, literally, he was treated to a lavish royal reception at the London Guildhall. And amazingly, there's another person in this room now who was with me at that reception, both journalists, Danilo Galpirovich, a good friend of mine. He was working then for the BBC, I was working for Kommersant. And we were standing there just watching this, a dictator who just destroyed what was left of independent media in his country, being toasted by British lords and members of the royal family and members of the British government. What sort of a message should he have received? And this was not just the Brits. I don't want to single them out. Of course, we remember George W. Bush, who was looking into Putin's eyes and getting a sense of his soul. Or remember Barack Obama with his infamous reset and his praising Vladimir Putin for the great work he was doing on behalf of the Russian people. And behind all of this, there's this old school that's sometimes referred to as, the realpolitik school, that holds that between interests and values, the West should always choose interests. Forget about values. Let them do what he wants domestically. Let our interests come first. Unfortunately, for people who believe in this idea, it never works. And as Mr. Putin has shown, I think, very clearly, it's only a matter of time before domestic repression translates into external aggression. And so those leaders in the West who had for years been turning a blind eye on the muzzling of the media, on the rigging of elections, on the beating up of peaceful demonstrators in Russia, and so on and so forth, one day they woke up to the first state-to-state territorial annexation in Europe since the end of the Second World War, which Vladimir Putin accomplished on March the 18th, 2014. And so I think there's an important lesson for that going forward. And that lesson actually has a reverse expression as well. And one of the best people symbolizing that reverse lesson is sitting to my left here, and I'm very humbled to be speaking this afternoon in the company of Andrei Kozyrev, the legendary first foreign minister of independent Russia in the 1990s, whose time in government, I think, showed very well that the reverse is also true. That when Russia, yes, I'm speaking about you, when Russia aspires to such values and such notions as democracy, the rule of law, and respect for human rights domestically, it also behaves in a responsible and democratic fashion on the world stage. And last week I was in Tallinn for a conference, Leonard Meri conference, that they have every year. And when I'm in Tallinn, I always make a point of going to Nune Street, which is a small street just off the old city in Tallinn. And on that old city wall, there's a bas-relief that was installed a few years ago, in which, in 3 languages, Russian, Estonian, and English, it is written that this bas-relief is installed to honor the memory of the first president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin, to honor his role and to commemorate his role in the peaceful restoration of the independence of the Baltic states. And I stand and I watch that bas-relief, and I watch Western tourists come by, people from America, Germany, and you can kind of see they stop by, they read the text, and you see the amazement in their eyes, because in 2018, it's very difficult to imagine how a president of Russia could help a Soviet captive nation achieve independence. That is exactly what happened. And we remember the 500,000 people who were standing on Manezhny Square in Moscow after Soviet tanks were sent to Vilnius under the slogan, "Hands off Lithuania." This was Russia as well. And so I think I want to end on this, on the optimistic point, because too often people fall into this predeterminism and inevitability, that this is how Russia always is. This is how it has to be. No, that's not how Russia always is. That's not how Russia has to be. But the foreign policy of Russia is directly dependent on the domestic situation. And it works both in a good way and in a bad way. And of course, for the last almost 19 years, it has worked in a very bad way under Mr. Putin. But of course, when, and it is only a question of when, not if, Russia undergoes that change again domestically, and the next time a window of opportunity comes for a democratic transition in Russia, I think people will see a very, very different policy, foreign policy coming from Moscow as well.
Thank you. I mean, I will point out that I don't think repressive regimes quite have the monopoly on foreign invasion, but certainly Russia itself has, you know, changed the way things are done in Europe, at least, even if others have been invading countries more recently. Mr. Minister, you're the only person on this panel who's actually made Russian foreign policy. So I would like to ask you if you think that the characterizations of what it's about, how it comes into being, and particularly how it's likely to come into being under Vladimir Putin over the next few years are about right, or if your own personal experience with the challenges of being in charge of that portfolio might take you in a slightly different direction.
First of all, I feel privileged to be in this panel. It's a little bit disappointing probably for the audience that we are all in the same basket, so to say, where we are all in agreement. I can't do anything because it's somehow managed from somewhere. So
can we get a little more
like,
pickup on his microphone?
It's like cloud management, or deep state. That's deep state.
Let's ask the deep state yet.
Yeah, it's supposed to be. That's how they operate, the deep state. Now, is it better now?
We hear you very well.
You hear me?
I do.
Actually, the audience is also very impressive. I can see some very knowledgeable people, and they could probably contribute much more than my humble self. In particular, my dear old friends, that is, we are friends for a long time. Gatis, Toby, and Charles, and they definitely know much more than I do. And I need one more footnote that my casual attire, different from the panel, is explainable because I am the former, while all of them are active politicians or whatever, think tank leaders. So for a former, I think I can be excused on that matter. As to the privileged position which I have in the end of this role is that everything was already said, and I cannot but agree with everything which was said. And I think that the theory which I expressed at that rally, actually, first time a large public, addressing large public, I used this formula when I was speaking at this rally, not this rally, the double-sized rally. 1 million people was were gathered in the Manesh Square after the failure of the so-called putsch or coup d'etat attempt. And that's where I said that democratic Russia will be as natural ally of the United States and other world democracies as the totalitarian Soviet Union was naturally enemy of democratic or free world. So in that, I completely agree with Vladimir that Russian foreign policy is function, actually, is dictated by its regime. And what I would like to maybe stress that it's very important always when we speak about Russia to distinguish between Russian national interests and regime's interests. The regime interests in most parts is different, if not opposite, to Russian national interest. Of course, Russian national interest is not to waste money or effort or even lives in Syria, and especially in Ukraine with the aggressive adventures, but to concentrate on economic and scientific and whatever development. And if we think of the best way, or probably the only way for Russia to advance, to develop, to become a modern country, that's partnership with the most developed countries in the world, especially in the so-called West, led so far, led by the United States. So national interests of Russian people, of Russian nation, should be in that field, in cooperative relationship with the West, while interest of the regime is basically the opposite, because they have to present an enemy which would justify the KGB or whatever the succession kind of organizations, or people coming actually mostly from the KGB background, to seize power, because you need enemy to justify why security forces should be in charge rather than democratically elected governments. And entwined with this major driver is the second one, which was manifested very, very obviously during the last election in the United States and in many other places. The other part of the same interest of Russian regime is to undermine living democracies by all means, be it cyber or kinetic weapons like in Ukraine. You know, it just depends on which one they can get away with. That dictates actually the choice of intensity and the choice of actual tools. But the idea is undermine democracy where it is and where it could be, where people aspiring for democratic change, however difficult it is, like in Ukraine. So these are basically two drivers, domestic agenda and undermining. And you mentioned that I was actively involved once in the foreign policy. And my experience kind of testifies that there is no conflict zones, no actual conflicting interest in foreign policy itself with the United States. I mean, we don't have a challenged boundaries. We don't have any kind of territorial claims against each other. We don't have even historic, grounds. I mean, historic grounds are totally opposite. We were, the United States, Russia once was in in help to America, and then America was in help to Russia, and even after the Bolshevik Revolution, the Americans in mass actually came to help to rebuild or build from scratch industry and modernity in Soviet Russia, which is forgotten. We were allies in both, actually, world wars, especially Second World War, and you name it. And till today, Russia and the United States cooperate in the outer space. So it only makes one step to descend from the outer space on the Earth, and that step depends on domestic development in Russia. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up a little bit. You say that the United States and Russia have no real foreign policy disagreements. The United States and a lot of its allies right now seem to be having a lot of foreign policy disagreements.
Yeah.
So I wonder, you know, if you were defining and designing Russian foreign policy today, which side would you be on? Insofar as the United States and many countries that it has traditionally agreed with seem to be in disagreement now. So on things like withdrawing from the Iran deal, on the tariffs that have been imposed on several countries, the Canadians say. I mean, where would Russia fall if you were in charge?
Well, even being an American taxpayer right now.
Perhaps especially being an American taxpayer right now.
How many former Russian foreign ministers do you have as American taxpayers? And
I am on the side of American democracy, and I hope that it will stand and it will pass this tough experience. That's basically what I keep my fingers crossed, and what I see brings me to think that it is not only Russian problem, domestic situation and the domestic political dynamics. Unfortunately, first time ever in my lifetime, I start to think that democratic America would be as natural ally of other democracies, especially European democracies, as, here I make a full stop for now, we'll see. As to Iran deal, I think it's the withdrawal from the deal is total mistake. I started my diplomatic career even in the Soviet Foreign Ministry in the field of arms control. This is a very, very tricky game. I agree. I mean, I was always very skeptical, and it always leads to continuation of contest or whatever rivalry or even conflict in other fields. If two countries are in conflict, the weapons is not like the army or whatever, the military might is not the source, the cause of that. It's just another manifestation, another tool they use. Except that the nuclear weapons and the nuclear missile weapons and the other weapons of mass destruction, they are too powerful tools to use, actually. So it's better probably if they are controlled or kind of managed jointly as much as it's possible. With all limitations, but the Iranian deal provided at least some time frame, more or less assured, or probably quite assured, that Iran would not follow up on building the bomb and becoming nuclear power. It might also last for forever, actually, because that's what the agreement stipulates. But anyway, even 8, 10, 15 years, however you read the document, it's a long story in history, and in that time the regime could change. Like in Soviet Union, who would dream of change of the regime in the end of 90s, and in decade it changed radically, and then next decade it again changed back also radically. So 10 years or 15 years, it's a good time to at least to deal with aggressive Iran, but not weaponized, nuclear weaponized Iran. And now we'll see. So to my mind, it boils down to kind of public affairs, or show off, so to say, fake diplomacy. I'm sorry for that, but the same I can say as far as we see it now. The other tough case, Korea, North Korea. I mean, it's very hard to imagine that the North Koreans would actually give up their nuclear arsenal, especially without tough control and tough measures and everything. And I mean, no selfie could substitute serious negotiations.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask this question of Vitaly, because you were working on a presidential campaign, you were thinking about what Russia's future could be, working to design policies. And my question is, I think there's a certain vision of a good Russian foreign policy from a Western perspective, which is mostly about Russia stopping certain things, right? Stopping intervention in Ukraine, stopping election interference. But I'm wondering what sort of a proactive agenda a democratic Russia, when it's seen as democratic, would have, particularly in the face of a United States that's less predictable. Is that something you discussed when you were defining the foreign policy plans for the campaign? And is this something that, can Russia play a stabilizing role on the world stage, and what would that look like?
Well, I believe it can, and it's important that Russia is part of world policy, like negotiation round, and I believe partly the problem of this isolation, what I mentioned before, lies in the exclusion of Russia from G8, G20 for various reasons, and they are fair, like Ukraine and so on. But I believe we should, and we, I mean like Russians on the one hand, but also Americans on the other hand, we should still find or try to find the ways or the strategies or a way to find a dialogue and reaching a hand towards each other. Of course, I'll just give a couple of examples. During campaign, such topics are really vital and important, so we define them almost daily, because every presidential candidate, but also every presidential campaign is defined by a news cycle day a day. And for instance, with former oppositional candidate, we were the only campaign, the only candidate who actively tried to build this bridge, tried to communicate and talk about those hot issues by, for example, going to United States right after the next sanction list got published, where none of Russian elected official was brave enough to go to the United States, to Washington, face the public, face the tough questions. So I believe it's really vital and important to do those steps. And I mean, look, when the president, the current president of the United States builds the bridge to most aggressive to really violent dictator. And by the way, there's no former diplomatic relationship between United States and Korea, and there's even every American who wants to travel there needs a special passport. But still, if we work on this side, I still don't understand why can't the United States work with Russia or Russia with the United States in the equal way, because I believe that the key to this to solving the problem lies in communication, but also lies in trying to solve mutually common problems like terrorism, like Syria, like a lot of conflicts. And I believe where's the will, there's a way. And sometimes I feel like there's no will on each side of the aisle to take this step forward, like to take the step as a first. Because partly on the Russian side, this reaching hand and then taking the first step is seen as a strategy of weakness or like weak position. In the same time, Putin and his regime is trapped in this economical downfall that is hard to explain, especially in the course of all these 10 years, 8 years of unbelievable prosperity, unbelievable flush of oil revenue, and still having this stagnation in the country. So it fits really well the narrative of this regime to blame some outside forces like United States or someone else. So the problem is really complex, but still I'm often using this example with Germany. You know, like after World War I, Germany was exactly in the same position, totally isolated to the United States, to the West, for the crimes, for aggressive military politics. And we all know what it led to, like nationalism and terrorists and Hitler and so on. And I believe with a smart agenda, with Marshall Plan, with trying to embrace such sometimes difficult partners like Nazi regime after World War II, like later the same economical wonder happened to Japan, to the UK. I believe there should be a way to embrace, to help Russia to develop and to get better for our own sake. So for the sake of world peace and also for prosperity for the United States, I believe this is really important. And by the way, sometimes I see like in some areas this collaboration still works. You know, like sometimes it's just media who like pushes this narrative pretty far, because if you look to some areas of national interest, of strategic national interest, like titanium or aluminum or military cooperation, just 2018, in March 2018, Russia, under sanctions, bought for $2.4 billion in the United States state papers, like the bonds. Like people just don't talk about. So I believe in some areas the cooperation is there, but in some areas it seems not to work. And I believe it's due to lack of political power and political willingness on both sides of the aisle, more than anything else.
Thank you. I mean, Germany and Japan had to be pretty massively defeated before they got any American support and help.
That's true,
right?
but in a way, Russia is defeated as well.
So, I mean, I think this is the question, right? Are we in the post-World War I environment with Versailles, or are we in the immediate pre-World War II environment? Vladimir, I listen.
With the sporting analogies as well that come to mind immediately.
I'm not as good at those, but
I'm not either.
So Vitaly laid out this concept where we could get along and we could coordinate policy between the US and Russia. Do you think that Vladimir Putin's Russia really can develop policies that are good for Russia and good for the world, or is it really a matter of waiting for the regime to change?
Well, I think after almost 19 years, it's pretty safe to say that nothing good come out of this regime, either domestically or in terms of foreign policy. And I think it's very important to always emphasize the point that Foreign Minister Kozyrov just mentioned a few minutes ago, that please don't equate Russia and Russian interest with this unelected authoritarian kleptocratic regime that is sitting in the Kremlin and its personal interest. They have nothing to do with each other. It's one of the biggest travesties that I hear is sometimes some supporters of Putin say, okay, we'll grant you that we have problems domestically, problems with economic inequality, with corruption, sure, with a lack of political freedom, people are being beaten up for going out to peaceful rallies, sure, have enough problems domestically, but at least Vladimir Putin managed to restore a proper standing in the world. That's one of their biggest lies. Frankly, to me, this sounds like, either like a mockery or like an insult. Because it was actually in the difficult, primarily economically difficult and tumultuous and complex 1990s when Russia became a full member of the Council of Europe, a full member of the G8, joined the IMF, the World Bank, everything that we call the pillars of modern international order, achieved a standing that befits a great and important power. And it was Mr. Putin that got us kicked out of the G8, that got our voting rights suspended in the Council of Europe, that managed to achieve the imposition of biting economic sanctions against our country. I don't know how that can favor our national interest. So when people say that at least Putin has some successes in foreign policy, no, he doesn't. And what he managed to do with his policies is to make a proud nation have almost a rogue status now in international affairs because of what he has been doing. And so I think fundamentally that everything Vladimir Putin has been doing in both domestic and foreign policy has directly contravened Russian national interest. And so we always, every time I meet with members of parliament or journalists or NGO leaders from the West, and they ask me how can we help the cause of democracy in Russia, the first thing I always say is, please stop saying Russia when you mean Putin. Because too many people in the West, journalists, politicians, people in the public space, they use, and I understand, I'm a former journalist myself, I understand the need for shorthand, and sometimes it's just easy to say Russia than to try to explain. But please go a little bit deeper. And don't just talk about Russian abuses, Russian behavior, sanctions. It is not Russia. It is a few hundred people around Putin, his former judo buddies, KGB colleagues, members of the Dacia Cooperative, Ozero near St. Petersburg. This is not Russia. Please don't equate a country with a small kleptocratic group of people that is misruling our country. And I think this point goes to the bottom of everything, both domestically and in foreign policy. So no, to answer your question, I frankly don't think there's anything good that come out of this regime. But when there are changes domestically in Russia, which will come inevitably, it helps, as I mentioned before, I'm a historian by education, and it helps sometimes to have that longer perspective. And one thing we do know about Russian history, if we go back a century again, is that major political changes in our country can happen suddenly and unexpectedly. And I doubt that, again, going to that intermix between domestic and foreign policy, I doubt that Vyacheslav Plevey, the Tsarist interior minister, when he boasted in early 1904 about the need for a small victorious war against Japan that would solve all the problems, all the domestic problems of the empire, I don't think he expected that about a year later Russia would be engulfed in a nationwide political strike, and the Tsar would be forced to grant his subjects civil and political rights in a national parliament. I don't think that Lenin, when he made his famous speech in January 1917 in Zurich to the young Swiss Social Democrats at the Volkshaus, which he ended by saying that my generation will not live to see the decisive battles of this coming revolution, I doubt that he expected that the Tsar would abdicate 7 weeks later. And Foreign Minister Kozyrov already mentioned how nobody at the beginning of the 1990s expected that the Soviet regime, one of the most repressive, one of the strongest totalitarian regimes in the history of the 20th century, would collapse in 3 days, as it did in August, between August 19th and 21st of 1991. 3 days. That's how things are happening. That's how things are done in Russia. And so, when people say today that Putin is invincible, he's omnipotent, his regime is going to be there for decades, this can only cause a smile, because we know that that's not how things are done in Russia. And I think it's very important to keep that difference in mind, and to keep in mind that there's nothing inevitable, nothing predetermined about the way the foreign policy is done in Russia, because the way the foreign policy is conducted today serves the very narrow political, personal, and economic interests of the group of power that have usurped, the group of people that have usurped power in our country for the last 2 decades. And when we have a foreign policy that actually reflects the true national interests of Russia and the Russian people, we'll see a very different one.
So, Natalia, I'm going to turn to you. I mean, I would say that the consensus of this panel is that the United States shouldn't particularly try, perhaps with the exception of Natalia. The consensus on the left here is the United States shouldn't try to have particularly good relations with Russia because Putin and his regime are irredeemable and don't reflect the will of the Russian people. Vitaly, I think, disagrees with that in the sense that you've got to have at least some level of coordination. You spend a lot of time working with people who have left Russia, and you spend a lot of time trying to explain Russia to American policymakers. In trying to explain Russia to American policymakers, is your advice to them, you know, should there be engagement, and if so, are there specific topics on which engagement is particularly crucial, whether that's, you know, to help keep dissidents alive, or to get arms control back on the table, or Syria, or what? How do you understand that?
Well, as I've previously said, there are a lot of global challenges, and of course the United States cannot ignore and have to continue engaging Russia on those important matters. But at the same time, it's important to divide and to probably apply a very a combination of containment, deterrence, and engagement. Contain Putin's regime, don't have too many relations with security services, with people who are engaged in propaganda and kleptocracy activities, and so on, and deter in many cases, but also engage more and more civil society, independent media, pro-democracy forces. There are more and more people now in Russia. Of course, there is such a perception that the Russian people rather would rather adjust to very tough circumstances, and we know that economically it's more and more difficult in Russia. We have the longest period of stagnation since Brezhnev era, and real incomes fall every year, like for 4 straight years. Probably the two good news on the economy from Russia is, number one is there are more billionaires in Russia this year, and number two, those billionaires actually have become even wealthier. That's it.
But their money's not in Russia. So
I understand that, of course. But at the same time, we see much more than all the media headlines suggest. We see more and more activity on the grassroots level. We see more and more people, especially younger generation, ready to go and protest and demand some changes in Russia. We see more and more people in regions that are ready to run for municipal elections. And we understand that the elections at the presidential or regional levels are quite strictly controlled by the Kremlin. There is still a big window of opportunities for pro-democracy forces on the municipal level, with over 200,000 municipal seats all across Russia. And we already have some breakthrough successes. Vitaly was part of that, and of course Open Russia and our organization as well, many others. We worked hard, and there are so many. There was a breakthrough success in Moscow in last municipal elections, when pro-democracy forces is now political force number 2, overperforming the Communist Party and Zhirinovsky's party. And they are newly institutionalized sprouts of pro-democracy forces, and they can be engaged to this dialogue. Actually, our Free Russia Foundation recently conducted a big conference with this delegation of newly elected municipal deputies, and those who are going to run again in the very important elections in St. Petersburg. So it's important to have this very realistic approach about Putin. Vladimir was remembering in '99 when he understood how he's going to rule. Probably maybe there was some window of opportunities in 2003, 2004, when there could be some competitive elections with an unknown outcome. But of course, the nature itself of Putin and his circle didn't suggest that. And we all remember this infamous Munich speech when he declared that the West should actually be okay with his disrespect for democracy and human rights inside Russia, and disrespect for sovereignty of Russian neighbors. And now what Putin says, he actually brags about the string of changing leaders of Western democracies. He says basically, US presidents come and go, and I stay and move on with my agenda.
Thank you.
Let's just
Do you
very
wanna jump
quickly on
in?
the point
Yeah.
of the engagement. I think Natalia made a very important point that when you talk about engagement with Russia, again, why do we just limit this to engagement with people in the Kremlin and foreign ministry? There are people-to-people contacts. There are civil society contacts. There are opportunities to engage with a great number of people in Russia who represent a different vision and a different future. And organizations like Natalia's do very important work in this regard. But even if we talk about engagement with the regime, it's for us, in any case, it's not a question about engaging or not engaging. It's not a question of talking or not talking for Western leaders with the Putin regime. It's a question of what you talk about. You know, an important world power such as the United States, for example, or any of the Western European countries, should be able to do more than one thing at a time. And we know that even in the darkest days of the Cold War, in the 70s and 80s, when there were high-level talks between the Soviet leadership and Western leaders, you know, U.S. leaders, for example, could at the same time successfully negotiate arms control agreements, like they did with the SALT and the INF treaties, and at the same time demand and very often secure the release of political prisoners. Even someone like Richard Nixon, who's not, you know, generally known for his commitment to human rights, he managed to, when he met Brezhnev in the mid-70s, he managed to secure the release of Vladimir Putin, who was one of the 7 people who demonstrated in Red Square in '68 against the invasion of Czechoslovakia, one of the most prominent political prisoners. He managed to secure his release. Of course, Ronald Reagan secured the release of many political prisoners in the Soviet Union. Today, that's not even on the agenda. I mean, today we had the opening day of the Football World Cup in Russia, in the Stadium, FIFA World Cup. Today is also the 31st day of the hunger strike of Oleg Sentsov, the Crimean film director who is sitting in the penal colony in the Yamalo-Nenets Autonomous District for opposing and publicly speaking out against the annexation of Crimea. He's been given a 20-year prison sentence. He's now on the 31st day of his hunger strike, protesting against the continuing detention of Ukrainian political prisoners in Russia. Today is also the day, the same day that the FIFA World Cup opened, is also the day when a court in the north of Russia has overturned the release of Yuri Dmitriev, historian, one of the leaders of the Memorial Society in Russia. This is someone who dedicated his life to documenting and uncovering the crimes of the Stalin regime, and returning the legacy and the names and the memory of victims of Stalin-era repression. He was arrested. He spent many months in detention, and a few months ago, he was actually found not guilty of most of the charges, which was considered a great victory and a rare victory for Russian civil society. Well, today, the court annulled that previous decision, so now he may be rearrested. He may be going back into prison. And I just want to remind you that, you know, as of today, there are more than 150 political and religious prisoners in Russia,
58.
according to the Memorial Human Rights Center. And this is a very conservative estimate, because Memorial is using the criteria that are established in Resolution 1900 of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe of what constitutes a political prisoner. So actually the number is probably much higher. But even using this most restrictive criteria, we have, I think it's 159 people as of today who are sitting in prison only because their political or religious views are different from the mainstream of the Russian government today. And we don't hear Western leaders calling for their release. We don't hear Western leaders saying their names out. There are still, I don't want to say that everybody's like that. Today the European Parliament, I think, unanimously passed a resolution on Oleg Sentsov. So there are people, certainly in parliaments around the Western democracies, who are raising these issues. But, you know, frankly, we don't hear a lot of that from the heads of the executives in Western countries. And even in the darkest days of the Cold War, people did that. And, you know, I just wish, so it's not about engaging or not engaging. It's about engaging with principles and engaging smartly. And I wish there were more of that.
Though sometimes they did that quietly, right? I mean, you were there for some of these engagements to release political prisoners. They were a matter of lists being handed over. I expect my name, or at least my parents' names were on some of those lists. So it wasn't that you stand up and you do this sometimes, but often it's not, you do it quietly. Is that not?
Well, it's supposed to be the common knowledge that diplomacy is better than anything, and that talking is better than going to war or something like that. But, you know, talking is not always, it's like in just ordinary life. Not always saying something or talking is the best way. Sometimes it's better to kind of have a pause, and sometimes it's better to keep silent, and sometimes silence speaks louder than words. So the same is true in diplomacy. Diplomacy is an art, actually. It's a profession, and it's an art like any professional field. And for America, for the West, actually, diplomacy was always a kind of a soft power instrument. Soft power is much better than, of course, the war power or hard power, but it needs very careful management. It should be used in a smart way. And not always it was the case, and unfortunately it is difficult to learn, probably, as we can see. What I mean is that in Soviet American diplomacy, there were very successful summits and very successful engagements, but there were flip-flops also. Like we can remember the so-called spirits of Geneva. There were probably more than one spirits of Geneva, and some of them ended up immediately in catastrophe, actually, political catastrophe. Soviets were very good, actually, in that. Especially after Stalin learned how to manage or how to communicate with Western leaders during the Second World War in a very, very special circumstances. But after that, the Soviet leaders, and I believe today's rulers, they very much appreciate cooperating and being having a photo opportunity with the Western leaders. Like Vladimir said that authoritarian regimes basically hate democracies. That's true, but they also, it's hate-love relationship. They also very much love to be seen as accepted by the Western leaders, especially by democratically elected leaders, because that also plays for their domestic image. One image is tough guy, but the other image is respectable guy. So looking for respectability, they sometimes trade some political prisoners or dissidents, or make gestures, sometimes even sign agreements, especially arms control, I should say, agreements which lead basically nowhere, because the moment they sign the agreement, there is already technology to move the arms race into a different direction. Like, you remember numerical limits on Russian and American missiles, and then immediately followed by mirroring, so-called mirroring, that is putting more than one warhead on the missile, thus making the numerical limits of the missiles senseless, right? Because the arms race went to the different direction of multiple warheads on one missile, and immediately the warheads or bombs multiplied from the previous level. So that's the game of disarmament, and people should be very aware of that. So not even each and every engagement which ends up with hugs and sometimes even kisses, like it happened with late Leonid Brezhnev. He was an alien guy, I mean, an old guy, good guy, basically by Soviet standards, very good guy. And good even because he usually offered dissidents or human rights activists in his late years, he offered a choice. You can immigrate, we will kick you off the country. It's more or less what Putin is now offering, or even some of the present company. And or we will put you in jail, but they would sometimes 3, 4, 5 times offer to leave rather than go to jail, because Brezhnev felt that he didn't want to have population in Gulag or having Gulag, because he had probably bad memory of the Stalin's time, being fearful at that time, like everyone else. So I mean, anyway, but not of these engagements, not of these agreements even, are good. I mean, it's the best agreement or the best engagement is well prepared. That's what I learned through my years. That was true in my time. I mean, when President Clinton, for instance, met with old Boris, as he called him, according to Strobe Talbot and his memoirs, he said that he liked old Boris. I mean, when he met and it was well prepared, it might lead to substantive results. Unfortunately, not always it was well prepared. And then it led to more anxiety that I witnessed, at least on one side, and Yeltsin felt a kind of betrayed even, that he read what the American president said one way, and the meaning was probably different, but I mean, so it was not well prepared, it was not based on pre-cooked agreement. So to my mind, the prescription for success in the diplomatic kitchen is to have everything pre-cooked as much as possible on a lower level. The lowest, I mean, the highest of the low level is Secretary of State or Foreign Minister, for that matter. But even that should be kind of end of some diplomatic process. Then it should be put on paper and agreed how you read this, like denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. I remember it even from my time. I heard about the readiness to have nuclear-free Korean Peninsula, but it was never put in terms of real verification of conditions of what it means, even when Korea had no nuclear weapons, but they were working on that, definitely. We knew that they were working on that. So I am all for diplomacy, but diplomacy means engaging. Diplomacy means talking, especially on high levels, but it also means not talking and not engaging. And finally, just a remark. You asked the question whether it's possible to achieve something with existing regime, with the Putin's Russia or Putin's regime. Yes, it is possible. Like football, for instance, a champion, it's very well organized so far as I saw the opening on the CNN. It looks like it's fantastically organized, everything done correctly, and Putin even made positive remarks and everything, and was all smiles. I mean, that's a good thing, probably. I mean, good thing for world sport. It's a good thing for Russian people, probably, and everything. But what is smart, that no Western leader is there to legitimize Putin's regime. It's good sport event and let it be so. I mean, there are much more serious things, I mean, politically more serious things, like Iran deal. Russia was a participant and is still participant of the Iran deal. Does it mean that Putin's regime changed? No. But that's a rare, relatively rare case when interests of the regime coincide with the interests of Russia, of Russian people. That's where you can speak of Russian interest. Russian interest, it was also the interest of the Soviet leadership to prevent a proliferation of nuclear weapons. If only because they want grandeur of being a nuclear power, and they don't want to be among dozens of other nuclear powers. Because today, what makes Russia great power is that it's a nuclear weapon state. So if there is Iran, Korea, and many others, then it becomes one of the many. If only for that, but there are more serious geopolitical reasons too. So yes, in that field, you can cooperate and you should cooperate, and Obama administration did correctly that they cooperated in that narrow field, very narrow defined, because you cannot cooperate with Russia to stop Iranian aggression in Syria, for instance, because that's where they are together. Iran and Russia are on the same side. So it's very important to see where you can cooperate or where you cannot. Like take terrorism.
I'm going to ask,
yeah,
because
sure.
I want the audience to have a chance to ask some
sorry.
questions,
Okay.
and maybe they'll ask the question you were about to answer also.
Okay.
So, but I think this, I do want to give the audience a chance. Some ground rules. Please wait until I ask for hands to go up before raising your hand. When called upon, please wait for the microphone. Upon having received the microphone, please identify yourself, and then please ask one question. If you have 2, 3, or 17, pick one. I'm going to take 3 at a time because we don't have a ton of time here. Go. Right here in the front.
Hello, hi. Voice of America Russian Service. My question is to Mr. Kozyrev. Recently, it's still rumors, but BuzzFeed suggesting that they have 2 confirmations from independent sources that President Trump not only said that Russia should change back, join back G7, but that Crimea is Russian because many people there speaks Russian, and it was Obama administration which actually lost Crimea to Russia. What do you think? Should G7 seriously consider taking Russia back, for example, to criticize it for the common, during sitting the common table for Syria, Ukraine, for something, and other international organizations like the Council of Europe, should they keep Russia inside while talking to it or punishing it? Thank you.
Great. Let's take another question. Right here. Keep walking down the line.
Anna Panutsa, University of Mannheim, Graduate School of Social Sciences. I just have a question for Vladimir, and I'm not sure, maybe from your analysis, what civil society groups in Russia are, in your opinion, under the most danger? And Natalia can probably answer too, but.
Great. We'll take one more. Yeah, let's just keep going down. We'll get the rest of the further back in the next round.
Dan Lehman, I was just wondering how you compare Russian foreign policy on balance with U.S. foreign policy, because Russian foreign policy is mainly involved in border states, and usually the situation has been resolved. And of course, they were also abstained in the attack on Libya, where U.S. foreign policy has been all around the world, in Iraq and Afghanistan and Somalia, helping Saudi Arabia and Yemen, has never really resolved the issue and resulted in huge casualties. So on balance, how would you compare Russian foreign policy and U.S. foreign policy?
Great. Okay, let's start.
The G7, let's see what happens with G7 itself. That's now, I mean, much less clear than it used to be. So depending on how the G7 evolves, it would be correct to answer your question whether Russia belongs to G7 or not. Basically what I think that, again, if it is well prepared, if it, as I said, well pre-cooked, why not invite Russia or Putin to a session of G7 to discuss something, a specific item? To invite him to come back as a member of G7 and make it G8 again, provided that G7 continues to be a club for most advanced industrial and democratic nations. That was the definition. And that's why we wanted, in my time, and we walked an extra mile, and particularly Clinton administration was very helpful with that, to be in G7, to join G7, to make it G8, because it was important for us also domestically to, to epitomize that we want Russia to be a democratic country, to be a great democracy and join other democracies. But to invite Putin, that would be, I think, a mockery of G7 as we used to know it. But again, let's see what happens to G7. To other international bodies, we don't have time to go each after the other. I would say that it requires very specific analysis what happens in those bodies, what they are actually addressing, and so on. So there is no general answer to all of them. But G7, it's more or less like based on democracy. As long as it is based on democracy, there is no permanent place for today's Russian regime.
Vladimir?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the question. It's an important one, and frankly, the answer is very simple. Anybody who is engaged in independent civil society activity is seen by the Kremlin as a threat and as an enemy. There's no such thing. And when the Foreign Agents Law was passed a few years ago, the law that slanderously and compulsorily labeled many Russian NGOs as quote-unquote foreign agents, initially when people looked at the law, many people thought, well, it's not that bad. It only targets NGOs that are involved in quote-unquote political activity. And so many NGOs who are involved in human rights work or environmental advocacy or women's rights or anything else, they said, well, we're not really involved in politics. Well, tough luck, because if you're involved in anything independent of the current Kremlin regime, for them that's politics. And so if you look at the list of foreign agents now designated on the website of the Russian Ministry of Justice, that includes everybody. Environmentalists, women's rights activists, you name it, anybody who's on there. Sociologists, the Levada Center. This is the last remaining more or less independent public opinion organization in Russia, the Levada Center, and they were prohibited from publishing any polling data during a so-called presidential election campaign in February and March, because they're now designated as a foreign agent. And by the way, for many people, it's just the designation itself, even if it did not have any practical consequences, which it does, but even if it didn't, for a lot of people, that's offensive, that's insulting, that's slanderous. Memorial was designated as a foreign agent. That's an organization that was founded by Andrei Sakharov in 1988. That's the most respected human rights organization in Russia. And Putin labeled it a foreign agent. That's insulting for people who work there. And so if you're enrolled in anything you're a threat and an enemy for them. And apart from foreign agents, there's also another category now, which is called the category of undesirable organizations. And my own organization, Open Russia, is now in that category since April of last year. And officially, we're prohibited from doing anything in Russia, prohibited from operating in the country altogether. All of our websites are blocked. Of course, the other question is how effective that blocking is. And I know nothing about technology. It takes me about 30 seconds when I'm in Moscow on my phone to open any of the quote-unquote blocked websites. So the Russian people are creative. We can find ways of going around that. But as far as the government is concerned, everything is blocked. And on a more serious note, I think they're very brazen about making sure that people understand and see that anything that's not under their control is outlawed and prohibited. I remember we had, about 18 months ago, we had a rally in St. Petersburg with our colleagues. Just a peaceful rally, we had musicians playing guitars, meeting with people. Two of the people who spoke at the rallies were actually registered candidates for the St. Petersburg legislature. And then 2 police buses arrived. They took us all in, put us in buses. I was escorted by 4 machine gun armed SWAT team officers. And I'm not a violent guy. I don't need to be escorted by 4 machine gun armed officers. But they do this on purpose. When you have a peaceful opposition rally, like we did just a few weeks ago on the 5th of May, 2 days before Putin's inauguration, people came out to peacefully protest, to express their right that they have under Article 31 of the Russian Constitution to the right to a peaceful assembly. They were met, these are peaceful people, families with young children in many cases. They were met with full riot gear, National Guard and riot police, with SWAT teams. And this time, this was new, for the first time, the government also contracted private paramilitary groups that were dressed in Tsarist era Cossack uniforms, and they had whips. And they were beating people up with those whips. And on one single day, 1,600 arrests were made across the country. These are peaceful protesters. They didn't break any windows, they didn't set fire anything, they just came out to protest on the streets of their own cities. And they were beaten up and arrested. And this is on purpose. The regime does this on purpose to show that any activity that is not controlled by us, that's how it's going to be. That's how it's going to be handled. And many people who start out thinking that what they do has nothing to do with politics realize that according to the regime it does. Like, for example, the Khimki Forest Defenders, the movement that originated about 7-8 years ago, led by Evgenia Chirikova. Originally, she told this to me and many others many times. She said, I didn't want to have anything to do with politics. I just wanted to protect my forest that was being destroyed because a company that is owned by Putin's old friend from Leningrad was receiving these multi-billion-dollar contracts to build a private road through it. But she very quickly found out that that kind of activity in the Kremlin's eyes is, almost treason. Anything you're involved in that's not controlled by them, for them is treason. So that's the answer. And I want to very quickly comment as well on the point that Daniil raised and that Foreign Minister Kozyrev just talked about. I think that absolutely Russia should return to the G7 and it should become again the G8, but not before the day when Russia becomes a democracy, and not before the day that we have a government that respects the rule of law both at home and abroad. That was why we were invited in the G7 in the first place. This happened, actually, it's the 21st anniversary now, this week. This was in June of 1997. There was a G7 summit in Denver, Colorado, at which the 7 leaders unanimously adopted a communique saying that Russia has made such great strides on the road to democratic transition and transition to a market economy that we feel the time is right now to invite Russia as a full participant. And in 1998, 20 years ago, the United Kingdom hosted the first full official G8 summit in Birmingham. That was, of course, a very different and much more hopeful time. And then very quickly, when Mr. Putin came into power, the G8 kind of, became a pretty bizarre institution because officially, as Mr. Kozyrev just said, it's supposed to be the club of the leading industrial advanced democracies of the world. And of course, Mr. Putin very quickly finished off any traces of democracy that we had, but yet for years he continued to be invited to those summits. And it did take the first territorial annexation in Europe since the Second World War to end his participation, although there could have been many other reasons. But in the early 2000s, when the initial legislation was tabled here in the US Congress, calling for the suspension of Russia from the G8 because of Putin's anti-democratic policies, that legislation was actually, if you look, it's still available on the websites of Congress. It was introduced by Tom Lantos and John McCain. It was very carefully worded, and it said that, we're not calling to expel Russia from the G8. We're calling to suspend the participation of the Putin government, which I think is a much better way of phrasing it. But of course, Putin in the end managed to get us kicked out completely. But I hope there will come a day when we're invited back, and when the G7 becomes a G8 again, because Russia is an important world power and it should be on the table, but only when it's a democracy. And on a Council of Europe, I just came back from a trip to 5 different Council of Europe member states. In each of them I had meetings with members of parliament, and that was a question that all of them asked. Do you think we should expel Russia from the Council of Europe? And I told all of them that if you do that, Putin's going to have a field day. Because he wants you to expel Russia from the Council of Europe. Because as Russian citizens, the last even formal protection that we have is from the European Court of Human Rights. Because we as Russian citizens, because of our membership in the Council of Europe, that happened thanks in large part to the efforts of Foreign Minister Kozyrev in the early 1990s. Because we are members of the Council of Europe, we have those protections. They're very weak, as you know well. They're imperfect. The Putin government ignores them very often, these decisions. But at least we have that, and at least we have that formal protection of the European Convention of Human Rights. The closest place for me as a Russian citizen to find justice today is in Strasbourg, especially in any politically motivated case. I do have actually a case pending in Strasbourg, as do many other opposition activists in Russia. If the Council of Europe expels Russia, it's going to punish the citizens of Russia, not the Putin regime. That's very different in that sense from the G8, so I'm glad you raised those two in the same question, because they're very different things. Putin was kicked out from the G8 because G8 was basically serving as his, for his personal photo ops and for his personal image and prestige. Council of Europe memberships serves the 140 million citizens of Russia. And if the Council of Europe expels us, it's going to punish 140 million citizens of Russia, not Vladimir Putin. But I do have to add that that's different from accepting the illegitimate members of the so-called Russian parliament in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. That's a different matter, which of course, as you know now, well, they're not there anymore. But Russia is still a member of the Council of Europe. And I think that every time I meet Council of Europe parliamentarians, I tell them, if you do that, Putin's going to open the bottle of champagne. Please don't. That's one of the last few protections we have as citizens of Russia.
Thank you. Vitaly, do you have anything to add on any of these topics?
These particular topics?
You'll pass and wait for the next round.
Well, I found actually what Andrei said before, it's a little bit off the topic a little bit, but he said 10 minutes ago something interesting about the ways how we can cooperate and can build like the roads or like bridges together. And I found it interesting, this metaphor or this example of Andrei and the soccer tournament right now. And that made me think of Nixon time and actually this very famous ping pong politics. And I thought, look, on the one hand, like China, Mao and Nixon back then, 71 had the very same problem, like lack of communication, lack of diplomatic engagement, and still this ping pong players, like Americans, were the first Americans to visit China, I believe after 49 or something like that. So, and it was the start of a new era of communication, of new era of engagement. And look, we just talked with Vladimir about 2 days ago the whole huge march of capitals here. There are always musicians, sportsmen, or academics, or like poets who, in a time of Cold War, in a time of this disengagement, could be this bridge or this beginning of communication, like this ping pong politics. It could be like, I don't know, like Ovi politics or like capitalist politics that can help like someone who has been seen here as a big hero who brought this huge victory to Washington, D.C. At the same time, ironically, being one of the founders of Putin teams, like absolutely pro-Putin guy, Ovechkin. And while I'm standing there at the National Mall among 200,000 people, none of Americans crosses the mind that you guys celebrate right now like free Russians, like going down the Constitution Avenue, like downtown capital of Washington D.C. And not seeing the connection to Putin and Putin team and so on. Why? Because there's a just pure joy of sports achievements and mutual victory. And I believe this was a great example of Andrei, where the politics could start to engage. Not with Putin. I totally agree. Like I totally agree with Vladimir. 18 years of Putin's regime shown pretty much there is no way to deal with this guy. But also the way to get rid of this regime is to build new types of politics, to engage, to educate, to run campaigns, independent campaigns, and also engage on maybe on a sports level. Why not? Like if Ovi takes tomorrow the Stanley Cup to Russia, maybe that's the way. I don't know, but at least those are like little steps that we have to take, like Nixon back then in 71 did with ping pong politics. I believe this is a good approach, and it could be a way to go. Maybe it's not going to work, but it's still worth to try.
Okay, Natalia.
I just wanted to say about the importance of signals and this question that Danila asked. And Vladimir very often remembers the story how we were protesting the next day after the previous presidential elections on March 5, 2012 on the Pushkinskaya Square. And when later we received this news that the US congratulated Russian people with the victory of the presidential victory. Or Vladimir mentioned the hunger strike of Alexei and 158 political prisoners in Russia. And it's not the best day for Trump to say that Crimea is Russian because they speak Russian there. And just continuing this logic, the US is England because you speak English here, some Spain, and with some Russian oblasts in Oregon and Alaska. But these signals are very important. It's not
on this panel.
It's not an exaggeration to say that current Putin's Russia is a mafia state, and when you deal with it, always remember about that. It's survival for them domestically and internationally to act in a disruptive manner at the international level and to suppress opposition domestically. And also keep in mind who is making the foreign policy decisions in Russia. Mr. Kozyrev said that the US uses diplomacy as soft power. Well, Putin's Russia uses it as sharp power. Another thing, and also who else makes decisions is National Security Council, obviously, and who are on this council, unelected, of course, generals of the army and security services, former head of FSB, Patrushev is head of it, and Alexander Bortnikov, current head, is on it. And they all treat the West as an existential threat. I remember Patrushev's speech in 2005 in State Duma when he declared all foreign organizations where I was working as an enemy. I started to pack suitcases back then, but I had to pack it, not forever, but for some time in 2012. When I was forced to leave Russia within 48 hours, and since that time I cannot go back. My son cannot see his father, and that's why I want my country back. So it's important to remember such things. And what can inspire us is when I was leaving Russia back then in 2012, I was quite optimistic because I saw this rise of civic protest, this demand of Russians for free and fair elections, for some justice. The situation was completely different in 2014 when I was moving to the US, when Crimea and Ukraine happened, and I didn't know if it was my country any longer, if it was my people. But 2017 returned me this hope and optimism. I especially really could see this many people geographically, but it's not the most important thing. The most important thing is, again, our younger generation is, I think it was underestimated by both authorities and the opposition, that really they are capable to critical thinking despite all the educational reforms. So there is such hope for the future.
Thank you, Natalia. I think that's, I hoped to have a little bit more time, but we are out of time and we do have to vacate the conference room. But I think that's a really nice note to end on. So please join me in thanking this really impressive panel for their comments.